So if you're watching this video, there's a good chance you've had a look around on the internet and you haven't been able to find a way to actually create a PowerPoint toolbar. So the point of this video is we're going to be creating this toolbar right here. There's a couple of features. We have swap, rectangle position, get size, and set size. Position also has get position and set position. And then using these features, we can actually test them out. So here we have 1 and 2. If we click swap, we'll see that they change position. If I click rectangle, it inserts an extra shape in the middle. Alternatively, if I click on the number 3 rectangle, run get position, I can then click another one and run set, and it works. Next, I can also get the size of this 3 rectangle, select another rectangle and click set, and it'll also work. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be replicating this from scratch. There's also some resources in the description which will provide you with a copy of a template as well as this specific toolbar, which we're going to be creating now. First, we're going to start by looking at some of the resources we'll need. First, we have Office Ribbon X Editor. This is the software that allows us to add XML to a macro-enabled PowerPoint template, and we'll be using this to actually create the UI for our toolbar. To download it, we have to go to Releases, and then if you scroll down from the first version at the top, we'll see Self-Contained Net6 Binaries, and this is a zip folder. So download this one and then we'll move on. Next, we have the docs for the UI itself. And if you're ever in doubt about what something means, what it does, what children it can have, scroll down here, you'll find exactly what you're looking for. Some useful things to look at are, for example, on load. This is a function that's called when the ribbon is first initialized, or when you open up a new PowerPoint, this function will be executed and it can allow you to initialize any variables that you require. Moving on, if we scroll down a little bit, we'll find group, and this is actually the outer grouping here, utilities, which allows us to put multiple different controls within it. So if we go back, we'll also have box and button. So box allows you to arrange controls either vertically or horizontally. For example, here, if we were to use a box and make it horizontal, these 3 icons would be horizontal. So rectangle, position, get size. Lastly, we have the buttons themselves, which refers to a button specifically. So in this case, that would be something like swap and rectangle. These are buttons. Additionally, if we look at the rest of the list, we have other elements such as menu, which allows us to create a drop down, which is counterintuitive because there is drop down above, but for now just know that menu works. And there's also the split button, and this is a button combined with a drop down menu. Moving on, we also have the icons which we can use for each of our buttons, and if you scroll down through this list, clearly there's many. If you just take whatever the description is here at the top, we can use that to specify an image MSO, and this allows us to change our icon and make it more intuitive when you're using a toolbar, what each function actually does. This icon will also appear in the quick access toolbar. So for example, if I go here, right click and do add to quick access toolbar, it'll show up here. And for example, most people may have the quick access toolbar below the ribbon, and this means that it'll show up as that rectangle. Here I can do the same thing, it'll show up right there and it'll have the same functionality. So now we're going to start with creating our actual template. With PowerPoint open, we're going to start with a blank presentation, and then from here we're going to go to File, Save As, More Options, change to PPTM, and then we're going to save to our directory of choice. Here what we're going to do is rename it to PowerPoint. Hit OK, and now what we're going to do is we're going to close it. We can do this by pressing Ctrl W, or alternatively we can go to File and then click Close. Next, we're going to head to the download location of Ribbon X Editor. From here, we'll have the actual binaries zipped up in a folder. So we can either right click and extract this, or alternatively, you can open it up, copy everything and paste it somewhere. If we go inside, we'll scroll down a little bit and here we'll find Office Ribbon X Editor. Double click it, and now we can open our macro file. Great. Now we can right click it and insert a 2010 plus custom UI part. If you double click this file now, it'll open up the XML, and this is where we need our template. What we're going to be doing is copying this very simple template, and this will create the basic toolbar. To validate whether it actually works, we'll click the validate button, make sure everything is well formed, click OK, and then hit save. We can now open our macro file again by going to File and clicking on our toolbar. And we'll see that we have an extra tab on the ribbon. If we click on it, we have one button, About, and if we click it, nothing's happening. That's because no macros have actually been implemented on our toolbar just yet. We only have the XML for the UI. Click OK. Now what we're going to do is we need to close this. Every time you go to make an edit on the XML, you have to close the PowerPoint. So you can press Ctrl W, and then we can return to Ribbon X Editor. From here, we're going to start by making some changes. First, we're going to rename this to Utilities. Next, we're going to fix the label. This is what's actually shown on screen. And we're also going to be changing the icon, which is this image MSO. Image MSO refers to anything that was in that library document that I showed you earlier. If you do use just image, so without the MSO, this is referring to a custom icon, which we'll be inserting later as a test. Now we'll revert this back to MSO and change this to Toolbox Gallery. Next, we're going to be creating a button, and that's for swap. Here we want to change the label to swap. We also want to change our screen tip to swap position. And we're also going to change the super tip to swap position of the first two selected elements based on the top left corner. Great. And then we're just going to add this to a new line and hit tab to increase the indent. We're also going to be changing our image MSO to recurrence, add an extra attribute called size, and adjust our on action to have swap. So let me just quickly explain what each of these elements mean. ID has to be a unique ID, and this has to be associated with each element. So each element in this XML file has to have its own unique ID, and this is useful because, for example, if you have things on your quick access toolbar and you decide to update your toolbar itself, this ID ensures that what you're actually clicking on refers to the same macros. So when you update your toolbar, it doesn't make your quick access toolbar disappear or like make all of your shortcuts go away. Next, we have the label. So this is what's actually shown on screen in text. This is without you having to hover or anything. Next, you have the screen tip, which is what's shown as a bold heading when combined with a super tip in like a tooltip menu. Then you have the super tip itself, which is like a longer description for the associated screen tip. Then you have your image MSO as previously described. This is just the icon for your button. Then you have size, which specifies how big your button is going to be. By default, this is just a regular horizontal button, but if you specify large, it'll be full height. So that'll be 3 rows. And then finally, you have your on action, which is what happens or what macro should be called when you press the button itself. Here we're referring to the brain buffer module. And then within that module, we're referring to the swap macro. Great. So if we then click validate, so now we know everything's good to go. And then we hit save. We can return to PowerPoint, reopen our file, and then we'll see here we have an extra button. However, currently this button doesn't do anything. So if we select these 2 objects, hit swap, still not implemented. That's fine. We'll continue with the UI, and then I'll show you how to implement the different macros we're designing for. All right, let's go back to RibbonX editor. Next, we're going to be adding in our box. So we have our box, we've assigned it a unique ID, and now we're going to start by inserting our first button. So this was the rectangle button. If we wanted to, we can actually just copy this from here. That's our button implementation. Let's indent this once more. You'll see that this indent is actually 4 spaces. So what I'm going to do is go to settings and drop the tab width to 2. Accept. And if I hit tab now, it's only 2 spaces, which is what I want. For sake of simplicity, I'm going to be removing the screen tip and super tip just so everything fits on one line and it's clear what's going on. So we're going to be going to rectangle, change this to rectangle, make this shape rectangle, remove the size, and we're also going to be changing on action to add a rectangle. If I validate this now, everything's good. Hit save. So we have an error. This is because we currently have it open in PowerPoint, and I may be doing this throughout the rest of the tutorial, so bear with me. Open it up, Control W, go back, hit OK, try saving again. Everything's good. Go back to PowerPoint. What does our toolbar look like? Here we have rectangle as a button, which is exactly what we want. Great. So now we're going to continue with the rest of the buttons. Next, we actually have a menu. So M position is going to be our ID with a label of position, and then followed by image MSO of text box margins. Now within these drop-down menus, you have to insert more buttons. So what we're going to do is just copy our rectangle button and add one more. There we go. So these are going to be our get and set position buttons. Make sure that because we copy and pasted, that you have to review each element to make sure you actually updated it to what we want. So here we're going to be saying this is MB get position with a label of ampersand AMP semicolon get position. The reason why we have an ampersand here is because this is called an accelerator. So once you actually click on the drop down, this will underline the letter that you'll be needing to press in order to actually run the function. So currently, if you click on this drop down, if you press G, it'll run get position. I'll show you what this looks like later. Next, for image MSO, we're going to change this to the same as the original image MSO on the menu. And then we're also going to change our on action to get position. Similarly, we'll just copy this down and change everything to set. It might actually make sense to just copy this whole line, paste it down here, and then we change this to set this to set current region, and change this to set position. Now, if I validate what we have, double check that this is closed like it should be, hit save, go back, reopen it, and here we have our position menu. Now it seems like there's no icon on set position, so let's fix that. This is set current region, should actually be select current region. If we go close this, save and reopen, we'll find that it should now have its icon. Great. Close and go back to RibbonX editor. We can now add in our split button. From here, split capital B button, ID equals to SB size. We're now going to insert our starting button, which is the main button that will be clicked when people press on the button itself. We have get size with a label of get size, an image, and I'll be configuring this later, of panning hand size, and an on action of brain buffer get size. Great. And then we're also going to be adding in the menu. Now inside this menu, we're going to be inserting two buttons. This will be for get size and set size. So for get size, we can actually just copy this one, and we need to make sure that this ID is unique. So what we're going to do is just add in MB dash. Next, we're also going to be adding in our set size. So we'll just copy and paste this, fix the indent, change it to set, change the image to PowerPoint page setup. And then we're also going to change this to set and set. So now we validate, we have an issue. So each of these buttons is actually supposed to be self-closing. So we just need to add a space and a /. And then we still have one more issue, the same issue here on this button here. Right, so everything here is configured, but before we continue, I wanted to focus on this specific image right here. So here we have panning hand size. So what you can do is, if you want to add in a custom icon to make it easier to recognize a specific macro, or if there's something in the library that doesn't already exist, what you can do is you can actually create a custom icon. So my current photo editing software of choice is GIMP. And inside this, you can actually create a 32 by 32 image. As you can see, based on this rectangular selection, it's 32 by 32 pixels. And then you can create any kind of icon that you want. And this can be used when you export it as a PNG and then import it as a icon. So from here, we have this icon here. And what I have is, if I go over into my directory, what I've done is I've actually inserted it in the same directory just so it's easy to import. From this, we can actually go to insert icons, find out where that is, click our icon itself, click open, and now we have panning hand size in our macro enabled PowerPoint toolbar. We can now reference this image as normal, and it will actually show up in our toolbar as we want. So here, what I'll do is I'll just click validate, everything's good, hit save, and if we go back to PowerPoint, hit file, open our toolbar, and there we go. We have our S. The only problem is that we're now missing our size. So what's happened here is that I haven't put in image MSO. Validate, everything's good, close this, minimize, save, reopen, and there we are. We have all of our icons. Now, one thing to note is that when you're creating these icons, if you use all black, it'll actually toggle black and white when you're in dark mode, for example. However, keep in mind that when you have a drop down, nothing is toggled. It'll always show as is when you're using a custom icon. You can always fix this by making your backgrounds white, but mileage may vary. Any other color you use will probably show up as is. Haven't done enough testing, but just keep that in mind. And if we right click and add this to our quick access toolbar, we'll see that it's white as we want. With the bulk of the UI completed, there's just one thing left to do, and that's add in our hotkeys and shortcuts. So when you hit the Alt key, you'll see that it has Y2 as the default. And then within that, once you click Y2, you'll have Y1 through 4. So in order to fix this, what you can do is you can actually go to your RibbonX editor and add in what's called a key tip. We'll start off by making the key tip for our toolbar itself a X, and then we're going to be going into each of our different buttons and updating them to have their own specific key tip. So here we'll change this to S, then we'll change rectangle to key tip R, we'll change get position to GP, and then we'll also set the key tip to set to SP. Now, before I continue, I want to show you an interesting interaction. We validate, we'll see that we need to add in the rest of the tip. Validate again, everything's good. Make sure our toolbar is closed. Go back, hit save, and reopen. If we hit Alt and X, which is our new toolbar button, we'll see we have S, R, Y1, and Y2. If we take a quick look back at RibbonX editor, we'll see that we've assigned key tips to buttons which have accelerators. This doesn't work. The only thing that does work is if you actually assign the key tip to the menu itself. So what we're going to be doing is removing these and changing this key tip to P. We'll then continue on by adding our key tip to our split button. And say we have size and we want to make it something like SS. If I was to validate this, make sure that this is closed, minimize, save, and reopen. What's happening here is that we actually have Alt X and we have size and swap, which aren't assigned any keys at all. The reason why is because we have a conflict. What's happening here is that because we have something that has S as the first character with another character, that means that anything which has just S is automatically cancelled. So this won't work. If we change this to something like SW, validate, and then make sure we're closed, save, and then reopen, we'll see that if I go Alt X, we have our buttons because now they don't conflict at all. What's happening is when I press S, it'll actually isolate any button which has S as the first character. So if we want them to be just a single character, we have to make sure that there's no actual overlap or any other button which has S as the first character. So if we close this, go back, and we'll change our size key tip to E and leave swap as just S. Then because here we should actually have accelerators, so what we'll do is we'll put in our ampersand, AMP, semicolon, and then put in the same thing for set. If we now hit save, we can go back to PowerPoint, open it up, and we'll see Alt X gives us SRPE. And then if we go something like P, we have G and S as our accelerators. Alternatively, if I go E, we also have G and S as accelerators. And that's pretty much the UI done. Now, for us to move on, we now have to start implementing our macros because these buttons currently don't do anything. To do that, we'll first have to add in the developer tab. We can do this by right-clicking anywhere in the ribbon and going customize. We then just have to make sure that we find the developer tab, which is probably at the bottom, make sure that it's toggled on, and click OK. We should now see this. If you now click on Visual Basic, it'll open up the Visual Basic editor, and this is the editor for our program. If we now go right click, insert module, and rename this to brain buffer so it links with our XML. Okay, with our module created, we're going to be looking at how to implement our macros a lot faster. So what I've done is I've engineered a prompt which will allow you to implement different macros based on a simple description of what you want it to do. If you click on continue this conversation at the bottom, it'll take you to this page. And here you can start typing out what you want the macro to do. In this instance, we want swap. So I'll say write a macro that swaps the location of the first two shapes selected. Here's our macro, and I think it's a pretty decent high-level implementation, only there are a couple things that need to be adjusted. So we'll start off by just clicking copy code. Next, we'll go back to our editor and paste it in. The first thing we'll do is we'll add in option explicit to make sure that all variables have been declared properly. Next, what we're going to do is we're just going to take this statement, replace everything from here to then as a space, and remove this line here. You can do this quickly in this editor by doing Control Y, which is probably the weirdest shortcut I've ever used. Next, we're going to take this, move it up top, and then if we clear up these spaces, we can now start reading through the rest of the method. So here what we're saying is we have selected shapes as a range. We have these two shapes here. And what we actually want to do is we need to set an intermediate left and top in order to swap their positions. So the only thing that doesn't make sense here is setting them to nothing at the very end. Then if we look back, we'll have get the position of shape 1, which we save as our variables. And then we do a swap between shape 1 and shape 2 and set shape 2 to equal the original shape 1 position. So this looks ready for use. If we just go back to this window here, delete all of these text boxes, add in two shapes, we can then add in a 1 and a 2. And if we select both of these, go here and click swap, we'll see that we haven't actually named our function properly. So if we go back, we can change this to swap. And we also need to add in the control for our button by doing control as iRibbon control. And if we now hit save and go back, swap is working as we want. Great. Next, we need to add in a rectangle. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our prompt and we're going to type in, write a macro that adds a rectangle to the center of the current slide. Here we have the general outline for our function, and we're just going to copy this into our editor. We're going to paste it in. We'll start off with the things we forgot last time, make this add rectangle, add in our control, and then we're going to read through it. So let's drop this down. First, we check for an active presentation. So we can just drop everything from here to here, remove this line, and then we can also check for the active slide. That's fine. We'll just change this to a space, drop this line. Next, we have the slide itself. We'll get the width and the height, and then from there, we'll calculate where the center is. And then we add in a shape. And what we do is we position the left and the top to equal these positions, which account for our rectangle's width and height. And then what we do is we don't need these variables to be set to nothing. Okay, now if we save this and we go back and we press rectangle, we'll get a big rectangle. There we go. So currently this is setting a rectangle which is equal to half the dimensions of the width and height. If we wanted it to be something else, we could actually just say rectangle width is equal to, say, 200 and the height is 100. I then save and go back and click rectangle, we get a much nicer, smaller rectangle. Now we can move on to the next function. To do this, we'll go back to our prompt and we'll type in that we want something that'll get a position and save it to global variables. Right, a macro that saves the position of the first selected shape to global variables. Alright, so this looks pretty simple. So what it's doing here is it's just saying explicit as we had before, G for global, shape left and top. And then what we do is we just check, is this a valid selection, get the first shape and then save it to the variables. So let's copy this over. Let's do this as get position, add in our control, and then what we'll do is we'll just move this up to the top and delete this extra explicit call. Now we'll just clear up this extra message box, delete this extra line, and delete this set to nothing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue along and get the set method so that we can actually test it out. Okay, so now we're going to just copy this over, paste it in, get rid of these as they're already defined, and change this to set position, add in our control. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to clean this up, delete this line, and then go through each shape, and then for each shape, set them to the global values, and then clean up these extra lines at the bottom. So if we go back into our PowerPoint, if we save it, and then say, okay, let's drag this over here, let's run a get position, and then let's click on 2 and do set position. And that's moved into that top left position. As you can see, if I select both, these are overlapping perfectly. Next, what we can do is we can actually, just so you can clearly see it, I'll change the fill to none. Okay, so get and set position are working as intended. Additionally, if I move this over here, then I do a get position and select these two, I can move both of them into that exact spot. Okay, the last thing we're going to be doing is implementing that get size. So this one's pretty simple, but what I'll do is I'll keep using the same approach for getting those macros. Okay, as you can see, we have 2 extra global variables, and then this is pretty much the same method that we use for get position. Copy this, let's go back into our editor. Here we have get size, control, and then we have these variables which will move to the top, and then we'll also remove this extra explicit call. And then from here, clean this up. And everything else looks okay, minus this one line here. That's get size. And you'll see that this actually looks exactly the same as our get position method. Now we'll do the set size. And the way you do that is you go back here and then you write in, write a macro sets the size of all selected shapes to the size saved in global variables. So now that we have this method written out, we'll just copy it, go back, paste it, change it to set size, update this with our control, and then what we'll do is we will clean this up, remove these end lines, and then as we can see, we're just checking for each shape, set its width and height to the global value. We just need to remove these extra lines at the top, and now we should be good to go. So if I look back to our PowerPoint, we'll see if I change the size of this to something really narrow, I can do get size, and then if I click on these 2 shapes, I can do set size, and it works as we want. That pretty much wraps up the whole implementation aspect. The only things that I wanted to cover was that if we go back here, you'll see that in the group itself, I have the image MSO set to toolbox gallery. The reason why you do this is because when this gets really narrow, so the whole PowerPoint window, it'll actually collapse into a single icon. For example, if I click on the Home tab and then I minimize this window, you'll see that things have collapsed into drawing and editing. And this is the icon that's shown when you put an image on a group. So if I expand this, you'll see that we had drawing and editing. Similarly, when this collapses, it'll show you utilities and have a toolbox icon. It's really useful if you have people on different screens and you need to make sure that they can find what they want. Otherwise, it'll give you a generic circular icon and it's quite hard to tell what exactly it means. Finally, I wanted to do a quick run over of how to debug the different functions that you write. So for example, if I go back to the editor, here we have set size. And what you can do is if you don't see this menu here already, you can go to View, Toolbars, and then turn on Debug. And that'll give you this menu here. And you can move it around by dragging on these dots on the left. With that, you can actually expand this local and watches window. If you don't see these, you can go to View and then click on them here. And then you can click on the left-hand side here next to any active line. So for example, here. Before this line is run, it'll pause execution. So what happens is with this set, if I go back to the actual PowerPoint and I say, okay, let's do get size, and let's select these two and do set, it'll take me back here. And this is what I want, because what I can do now is if I snap this to the right and snap this to the left, as it's executing, I can just step through and see what's happening. So if I go step into, it's looking at the first shape, it set the width, set the height, onto the next shape, set the width, set the height, and then it'll exit. And that's everything. That's how you can debug your functions. So if you have a problem, you can actually test where exactly is it going wrong or why is it throwing this error. Super useful. So I wanted to wrap up by talking about how to build a robust toolbar. What you want to do is you want to implement each of your functions on an exceptions basis to make sure that you aren't throwing errors when you try to handle something that isn't what you think it is. For example, there are many different types of ways to define what a rectangle is. It can be a placeholder, it can be a shape, it can also be a text box. All of these are treated differently. So if you try to do certain operations and you only filter for shapes, it probably won't work because sometimes it'll exclude certain types of boxes and that's probably not what you want. So make sure that you're checking what these types are. For example, during execution, if I go back to set, you can see what all the local variables are set to. So if I step through this, you'll see that shape here is currently a shape. And if I expand this down, I can look at the type. So here we have a type of MSO auto shape, and this is different to any other type of placeholder or text box. Just something to keep in mind and be wary of when you're building and testing. Otherwise, that pretty much covers everything. So I'll stop the debugger here, maximize this, and as you can see, we now have a nice toolbar which does some very rudimentary functions, but at least now you also have the tools that you'll need to implement additional functions. If you're ever short on ideas, I've also put in another prompt which will help you with generating more. If you just continue this conversation, you can say, give me 10 more. It'll literally give you more answers or inspiration. So with the toolbar's features implemented, if you want to distribute your toolbar as an add-in, you can go to File, Save As, go to More Options, select PPAM, which is right here. And then this is currently located within your add-ins folder. So what this does is if you save this here, it'll save it into your local directory for add-ins. And every time you start up PowerPoint, it'll load the add-in. For now, instead of saving here, I'm going to navigate to a different directory and save it over here. If I click save, that's done. And now if I want to load this every time I start up, I can go to Developer, PowerPoint Add-ins, Add New, go to that same folder, and then select this PPAM file and hit OK. Make sure that macros are enabled. If for some reason macros aren't enabled within your file and you can't seem to figure out why, there's a chance that you may have to go into the file itself, expand this here, right click, go to properties, and make sure that this unblock tag is set to true so that it allows all the macros to run inside. The reason why this happens is because there's a thing called the mark of the web, and that means that anytime you download a macro enabled file from the internet, by default, macros won't be able to run. So with that problem solved, if we go back, hit close, you'll see we now have it twice, and that's because we have the toolbar file itself open. So if we close it now, we'll see that we only have one, and this will show up every time we open a new PowerPoint. So for example, if I close PowerPoint completely and then reopen it, and I start with a blank presentation, we'll see that I now have this PowerPoint toolbar installed by default. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe. And if for some reason making a toolbar isn't enough and you want to sell your own Python program, watch this video.